Thanks very much, Jeff. Our next presenter is Bob Makinson. I'm sure most people in the room know Bob. Bob is a plant taxonomist and conservation botanist. He's lead author on the National Action Plan for Myrtle Rust in 2020 and has been active in awareness raising and response building on and around this pathogen since 2010. Bob's presentation this morning is Slow Learners, What Has Myrtle Rust Taught Australia About Biosecurity and an Effective Response to Invasive Environmental Diseases. It's my pleasure to welcome Bob.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in Myrtle Rust space. Jeff's alluded to some of it, and you'll be hearing about a couple more aspects in subsequent talks. There's been quite a lot of very positive developments in the research area and some in the conservation action area, but we still face a problem where we don't have a consolidated national effort around Myrtle Rust, and we haven't learned the lessons of Myrtle Rust in terms of preparedness for the next threats, as Jeff alluded to. So I'm going to try and cover some of that ground. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this country and of the countries from which we come and on which we work, and the traditions of custodianship and care for country that represents. We're all here in this room because we're trying to figure out in our own ways how to become better custodians for the bits we're responsible for. And the notion that some parts of the landscape are sacred and others aren't, to me, is part of the problem. The whole bloody landscape is sacred, and we need to treat it that way, with respect. I'm not going to dwell on the quickie revision slide because Jeff has covered much of that, other than to say Myrtle Rust is a very mobile threat, a very fast-moving threat, both spatially and in terms of its build-up within sites. It's resulted in 20 plus species undergoing really severe, sometimes catastrophic decline just in the short time it's been here. And there's another 20 or 30 plus on the slide. For some of those we lack good serial observations so far, so we're operating off snapshot data, but it's of that order. So quite a lot of species involved. Just a quickie revision on biosecurity. The biosecurity system operates at three levels. Pre-border, that's before something comes into the country. At the border, interdiction at the border. And post-border response. And for serious pests and diseases, that may involve an emergency response. And there are well-established mechanisms, mostly from the agricultural area, which ensure national coordination and funding for the period of that emergency response. That's usually aimed at eradication or containment, but the question is what comes after that if eradication and containment fail? There is then a transition to management, a very optimistic sort of title for some of these diseases. Management is very much a euphemism for we don't really know what we're doing, but we're going to throw a bit of money at it here and there. Our transition to management preparedness for future environmental pathogens, pests too to some extent, but particularly for the pathogens, is not well developed. Our national security coordination, when that lapses, there is no pickup mechanism by the states and territories collectively. Individually, states may respond well, and I might say Angela's news about the Queensland moving towards a state action plan on Myrtle Rust is extremely welcome news. That's going to be a big step forward. But the question is, what do we do nationally at a coordinated and funded and resourced level that enables a sustained national response? Departments of primary industry have the expertise on pathogens, but their charter is for agriculture and forestry and fisheries. It's not for environmental management. The environmental agencies have the responsibility for environmental management, but by and large they don't have the pathogen expertise and they don't have the funding allocations to develop it. On Myrtle Rust we dropped the ball essentially for 8 years. It was first detected in 2010. There was a key threatening process determination for New South Wales quite early in the process, but after that there was very little from government level for another 8 years or so. It was clear from the research that Jeff and Angus had initiated and sustained, sometimes against the odds, that there was crash decline in some species. But it wasn't until the first listings of species as a result of Myrtle Rust in 2018, late 2018 and early 2019, that an environmental agency response could kick in. And that was in New South Wales, and that's because the Saving Our Species programs has a charter which limits its actions to listed threatened species. So until you get them listed, you can't do much. And 12 years into the whole process, before we got any funding for the development of a meta collection for a single species, ex situ. So a dead ball zone essentially for 8 years. The 2010 response was vigorous, it was good. It had a lot of hiccups. There was a lot of secret squirrel stuff, which wasn't productive. The response was off again as far as the Commonwealth was concerned, although the state effort in New South Wales, involving personnel from both primary industry and the Environment Agency, was very vigorous and good. Some settings have improved since those days, which I won't dwell on, but the fundamental failure on Myrtle Rust was not one of the emergency response period. It was the failure of the environment agencies collectively around the country to pick the issue up and run with it after that emergency response lapsed, because it had been declared uneradicable. Those environment agencies were not prepared, they were not funded, and essentially at the time they were not willing to pick up the ball and develop any kind of action plan around Myrtle Rust. That had to come from the community of concern among a limited number of scientists and land managers. And this gap in the ability and willingness of the environment agencies to have a response mechanism in place after the emergency incursion response, the biosecurity response, persists to this day, and it holds for the next horrible disease to arrive. There was a transition to management program, a whole $1.5 million, 6 projects, none of them involving environmental actions. They were good stuff, basic information, but they weren't environmental action. That compares with New Zealand's investment of some $40 million for their 30 Myrtaceae species, compared to our 2,000 odd, within the first couple of years of their incursion. And it compares badly, of course, with any agricultural incursion you like to mention. We're trying to work out a way of giving Myrtle Rust to horses at this point. So our response has been funded inadequately. It's been piecemeal. It's been overwhelmingly from short-term competitive grant mechanisms, the pre-existing mechanisms, and there's nothing like the directed, targeted investment and sustained investment that applies in the ag situation. That retards our response. The conservation sector responses overall, however, are broader than just the agencies. Without the research that Jeff and Angus initiated back in 2011 and have continued to the present day, we'd be nowhere on this. There's been other researchers, of course, have also chipped in, but that was the core that really got us through those first few years and enabled the first listings. In 2012, there was a workshop at ANPC in Canberra, and the Commonwealth representative at that, or Commonwealth Environment Department representative at that workshop sort of scratched their head and looked at the ceiling and said, maybe we could do a threat abatement plan, a TAP. In 2016, there was a workshop in Brisbane, which Jeff largely convened, which was the beginning of the turning of the tide. 5 minutes. And the Commonwealth rep at that said, maybe we could do a TAP. And that was repeated in 2018 as well. Maybe we could do a TAP. In 2022, the Commonwealth actually committed to doing a threat abatement plan expedited within 2 or 3 years. And in 2023, late 2023, they reneged on that commitment. So at national level, the department has been nowhere. There are systemic disincentives to progress. One is the conflation of conservation with threatened species and listed threatened species. That listing is a slow process, it lags behind reality, it takes a lot of data, you've got to have money to get the data, it's a catch-22. The second problem is the prioritisation trap. The EPBC list, which as we know falls short of the real situation of extinction risk in Australia, has been refined down through the Threatened Species Strategy Action Plan to a list of some 30 plant species, only 2 of which are Myrtle Rust listed, and that's where the investment goes. There's very little outside that ambit. The National Action Plan for the crash decline species, the catastrophic decline species, is focused very much on germplasm capture and prolonged ex situ conservation, as Jeff has outlined, including the identification of resistance traits and their selection and for potential reintroduction. I won't dwell on the structure of the plan, but that's the gist of it for those particular species. I'd just like to show 2 slides that give a visual impression of progress. This is based on March data and it needs to be updated. There has been some progress since these 2 slides. But green on the 2 I'm about to show you indicates that actions have been largely completed for a particular class of conservation action. Orange is partial, yellow is barely begun, and white is not even addressed as yet. So of 62 taxa that one can construct from 2 combined priority lists, this is the first half of the set, and as you can see there's very little green on that and a hell of a lot of white. And the second half of the set there's a bit more green and a bit more orange, but basically we've got a very long way to go. There has been good progress on a number of species, and there's been some outstanding progress in the seed and tissue banking area. A considerable amount of that has come from the Australian Botanic Gardens at Mount Annan in Sydney, and there's been real progress in some other areas as well. And SOS New South Wales, Saving Our Species New South Wales, and Queensland DESI have been operating really well in this space, but it's not the same as a concerted national response. We're not any better prepared for the next incursion. There is a thing called the EPL list, which is still very poorly known in the conservation sector. That identifies coming threats that haven't yet arrived, including a set of plant diseases which we simply haven't workshopped in the environment sector to any great degree. So what do we need to do? Well, for funding, we need to get away from the near total reliance on competitive short-term grants and create, or the agencies need to create, options for directed discretionary funding to sustain activity against an environmental threat that has established and taken us beyond the biosecurity response phase. And a bigger pot is needed to do that. There's simply no way around that. We need to keep our priorities flexible rather than becoming set lists that date almost as soon as they're printed. We need a transition mechanism from the emergency response phase into ongoing quote-unquote management, or at least response, even if we can't actually manage the beast involved. And we need to upskill the environment agencies. That means wargaming situations across states, across departmental silos, and across the government, non-government divide. So those kinds of directions are where we need to go, I think. ANPC has tried to play its part since 2010. This slide just summarises some of the activity we've done. Thank you.